Welcome to PowerUp podcast, the podcast that seeks to empower and dismantle, giving us the power and confidence to question, deconstruct, rebuild, and expand in life. I'm your host, Amma Rouge, voiceover and multidisciplinary artist, well-being advocate, food and book geek with over 14 years of movement-centered experience.
I am your host, Ella Mesma, artist, choreographer, yogi and coach with a passion for alchemy, creativity, transformation and workplace wellness.
We recognise that we can't dismantle and empower or be empowered without first learning ourselves, diving deeper to unlearn the harmful, restrictive and unprogressive. It's an ongoing practice and journey for us all, which is why we created this podcast.
Our show features guests doing the work to enlighten, deconstruct and power up in their own magical ways.
We're going to be having conversations around the power of healing, transformation, well-being and creativity, and how they feed our personal and collective evolution, how they help us power up.
Shade. What is this business of shade? This fixation with hue, this delinquent melanin, the mixed ticks and tricks betwixt the box marked other. To fix this business of shade, the puzzle of origin, you call me black girl in America, red skin girl in Jamaica, yellow child, Creole, here, half caste. Also, I can be your métis, mulatto, Martinican, blue-eyed Chabine, or peau sauvée. But know this, from the skin that I'm in, the view is as clear as a tropical night. I see beyond histories of shade, and I know that this issue of hue is a problem concocted by you.
Some serious goosebumps right here. That poem was read by the incredible Dr Emily Zobel Marshall. Emily is an author, poet and reader in Postcolonial Literature at the School of Cultural Studies at Leeds Beckett University. Her research specialisms are the cultures and literatures of the African Diaspora, and she is widely published in these fields. She develops her creative work alongside her academic writing and has had poems published by the Peepal Tree Press anthology, Weighted Words 2021, Magma, The Loss issue 75 2019, Smoke Magazine issue 67 2020, and The Caribbean Writer, volume 34 2020, volume 35 2021, and volume 36 2021. Emily is Vice Chair of the David Olawale Memorial Association, a charity committed to fighting racism and homelessness, and a creative associate of the art-based youth charity, the Geraldine Connor Foundation. Whoop, 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 whoop.
Incredible.
Welcome, Emily.
We're so happy to have you on the show.
Thank you, Ella and Amma. It's an absolute delight to be here.
Emily, your grandfather was Joseph Zobel, the famous author of Sugarcane Alley or Black Shack Alley. And you mentioned him being considered too black in Martinique and the pigmentocracy in the Caribbean. Can you talk a little more on that?
Yes, Amma, I can. And, there's a very interesting word, that, isn't it? Pigmentocracy. So, the hierarchy of skin colour. And sadly, it's, I think, very rife in the Caribbean, but it's rife all around the world. Pigmentocracy operates especially in the Caribbean. Really, it's the legacy of enslavement and the legacy of colonialism. So the lighter skinned you are, the more you are seen as being able to be successful, and also your level of attractiveness is based often on your skin colour. So my grandfather, Joseph Zobel, as you said, is a well-known writer, but he really struggled as a boy in Martinique. He was very, very dark-skinned, and he had very African features. And it was considered that he married above his station because my grandmother was very light-skinned. So even though he was an incredibly bright boy, he was always considered to be looking too African or too dark for a woman who was considered of higher stature than he was because of her light skin. And actually, this carried over right into my own childhood. My grandmother sometimes referred to him as the African. And when I was born, I'm very light skinned. I'm much lighter skinned than my mother and my brother. So when I was born, my grandmother said I had peau sauvée, which means saved skin in Martinique. So the idea is that the lighter you are, your skin is saved. And it's an example of a really destructive type of internalized racism.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. It's not the first time I've heard, those kinds of words or those kinds of ideas. I was telling Ella just yesterday that I have a friend who is from Jamaica, and I would say she's quite fair, darker than you, Emily, lighter than me, and she wears her hair natural, and she's got a similar curl pattern to you in your hair, maybe a little bit tighter. And her grandma says to her, "Why are you wearing your hair like this? It looks so messy." And it's just so indicative of the generation that her grandmother is from, and these ideas around what's perceived as attractive and what's perceived as smart and what's perceived as neat, and all of what you spoke to.
Yeah, it's that hair politics is still really rife, isn't it? But it's been really interesting how I think that a lot of people have started to write about these issues around hair, like Emma Delberry, Don't Touch My Hair, and
Yeah.
in podcasts and books written which focus on celebrating natural hair and celebrating but at the same time my students often write about the hair politics, and they say you've got to celebrate. If you're a black woman, you should celebrate your natural hair, and you shouldn't straighten it, because by straightening it you're kowtowing to westernized standards of beauty. But then I think it's important to have choice, what often choice is taken away from women about the way they want to look. So if you want to straighten your hair, if you want to wear it curly, that should be your choice. And it's in some ways it's a shame that decision is always seen as a political move.
I've seen Black Shack Alley or Sugarcane Alley in Leeds at an amazing screening, and I thought it was a wonderful film and a wonderful story, and it'd be interesting to just hear a little bit more about your grandfather and the amazing things that he did go on to do, despite so much discrimination.
Yes, it was lovely to have you there, Ella, at that screening of his film in Leeds, and that was the celebration of the centenary of his birth. And so he grew up in Martinique, in a very poor village that on the edge of a cane field that people called La Rue Cazenègre, or Black Shack Alley. And he was very much destined for a life of cutting cane. And it was his grandmother who made these amazing sacrifices to enable him to not be stuck cutting cane all his life, but to go to school. So she actually refused to let him cut cane, and she went into the cane fields herself to get enough money to send him to school. And he really excelled in school, and eventually he got a scholarship, and he went to Paris, and there he found his way as a writer, and became very well known. And his first book, which has turned into a film, is that story of his life on Black Shack Alley and the sacrifices his grandmother made. And I always think that those sacrifices that she made, also mean that this is why I am able to live in this much more privileged life that I live now. And it's thanks to her that her sacrifices have reverberated through the generations and are still felt today for me. But my grandfather, interestingly, said that he felt more free. He felt better, and he said, as he described it in French, in his black man's skin in Paris. So in a white, a European and predominantly white European setting than he did in Martinique, because he felt that he had escaped some of that pigmentocracy. So not that Paris was completely, obviously, racially tolerant in any way, but he had escaped some of that constant judgment that he found in Martinique.
Wow, look at that. You would think it would be the opposite, but that speaks volumes.
Yeah. And it feels like it would be interesting to hear about your own experiences. Did you grow up, did you spend some of your childhood in Paris? Did you grow up in Martinique? Have you kind of experienced the differences between your experiences in the UK compared to Paris or Martinique, and whether you found something similar, or if you have a preference of where you've most enjoyed your experiences or felt most able to be yourself?
Yes, it's I grew up in North Wales, so I grew up in actually a really remote area of North Wales with this, with my Caribbean mum and my white English dad, and it was interesting because can be some anti-English feeling in Wales, especially North Wales, where there's a real focus on keeping the Welsh language alive. But a lot of Welsh people really accepted my mother into the community as a Black woman. I think that they felt that there was a sort of, a solidarity, because they had both been oppressed by the English in various ways. But my dad, as an English person, found it harder to be accepted. But I always felt that I was really proud of who I was, but I did feel sometimes that I wished I was darker skinned, so that people would look at me and just make a clear connection between me, my mum, and my brother. Sometimes I felt a little bit like the odd one out. So I did, when I was younger, wish I was a bit darker skinned. But when I went to Martinique for the first time, I had a boyfriend called Philou. And I remember some of the Martinican girls taking me to one side and saying, it kind of echoes my grandfather's experience, them saying, "Why are you going out with Philou? He looks far too African. He's far too dark." And it was, like a kind of a penny dropped. And I hadn't really analysed it before, but that same internalized racism, is like reverberated through the generations, and still sadly, alive and well in Martinique. But I've I think part of my perhaps reason for spending a lot of my life focusing on anti-racism and looking at colonial legacies and post-colonial writing has been also to do with this hybrid racial position that I occupy, where I am always analysing now race, and I'm always analysing the different power structures at play. And I think it perhaps does have also something to do with this quite complex, in-between positioning that you have as a light-skinned mixed race person.
And interestingly, I had a really similar experience, Emily, growing up. I always wanted to have darker skin and look more like my sister and look more like my mother, because it was this strange world that I seemed to exist in, where I knew that I was other, but that no one quite thought that I belonged anywhere. And I think it's a similar thing of how it shapes your perception of the world, because we experience many privileges, I think, of having light skin, but then we see so much, there's so much pain, like things that happen directly to me, because I grew up in a very small village where, we were the only mixed heritage family. Actually, there was one Black family, one mixed heritage family, and one Indian family, and everyone else was white. So we kind of, the three families ended up, we all knew each other, let's say. But I think that did really form, the wounds, everything that happened to anyone in that community. It happened to all of us, and it certainly has shaped who I am and how passionate I am about unlearning, for example, or about just trying to really promote a world where we don't live in such a pigmentocracy, or where we don't experience so much bias and racism.
Yeah, but that's really interesting, Ella. That's really interesting what you say there, and about how that also has, formed the basis of what you want to do today in your life. And I think that if somebody who is somebody who is of a kind of uncertain racial origin in the eyes of others, what you do is that you destabilize very monolithic ideas about race. So if people think, black people walk down the road like this, white people walk down the road like this, or black people do this, and then you have, well, what about those, all that massive, diverse, in between racial identity, and in a way, by being that betwixt and between, that you dismantle those very binary ideas about race. Because I'm always quite shocked when I go to the US. Yeah. And in the US, you really find those binaries, I think, are even stronger.
Yeah, they're very strong there. I find that as well when I go to visit family in the US. There's so much more a sense of separation and binary.
And even between countries, right? Like you're Puerto Rican, you're Dominican, and there's like those kind of distinctions, and almost like we don't speak to this community. And
yes, exactly. And in the US, I was asked by fellow academics, so how do you define yourself racially? And I said, well, I'm mixed heritage or dual heritage, and they were a group of black academics, and they were like, what are you saying? You're not calling yourself a black woman. Like, what? You should be calling yourself a black woman. And they were really outraged. And I said, well, in the UK, it's not seen as turning your back on your, or not being proud of your origins if you say I'm dual or mixed. But sometimes in some settings, if I'm in a group in a group of black women, and I said, and call myself black, they may be like, oh, okay, you are, you could call yourself black woman, but yet you experience with your lighter skin all sorts of little privileges, and you're not on the receiving end of all this unconscious bias in the same way as we are. So our experiences are different,
Yeah, Ella and I have talked about that a lot as well. There's an organisation called Halo Halo. I don't know if either of you are familiar with them, and they're amazing, and they're a platform for people who are of dual heritage, of mixed heritage, to share their stories, share about where they grew up, what their experiences have been, how that shaped them as adults. And they speak to this a lot, this idea that there can often be, whilst it's true, yes, of course, everyone will have had different experiences of bias or racism based on the shade of their skin. But I remember reading something specifically on their platform that said, whilst that is true, racism is racism, and we need to be careful about kind of almost this kind of infighting of saying, well, my racism is more painful than yours, or my racism is more extreme or worse than yours. As much as, of course, there will be different levels of experience, it doesn't diminish, a higher level of experience doesn't diminish someone else's level of experience that may seem like lower or less than.
I think that's a really interesting concept, Amma. And I think there's something really powerful in this, actually, of this coming together of, racism is racism, and can we share a space of healing, that we're all healing and we're all unlearning and we're all uniting through this unlearning and this coming together, and that can be a beautiful opportunity for growth.
Yeah,
and change.
Yeah, I agree, Ella. And change, exactly. And I think that one of the things that we need to be doing, like we're doing today, is having these conversations and having uncomfortable conversations with people. And not enough of that went on in my family. And I think my grandfather, my grandmother, they never scrutinized their position. Well, my grandfather did much more, but my grandmother didn't scrutinize the position on these things. So these biases, are left unchecked.
That actually leads really nicely into the question I wanted to ask you, based on what you were sharing with us about your experiences in Martinique. I wanted to ask whether you feel these conversations are being had in Martinique, because I know you said that pigmentocracy is still very much present. But based on your experiences, do you feel like the space for the conversations are opening up, or do you feel that there's a complete closedness to it still?
That's a really interesting question, Amma. I think in the I'm connected more to, I guess, at the moment to Martinique more in a kind of scholarly world. So I see the academic writing and the creative writing that's coming out, and the poetry and film that's coming out of Martinique, and I think in that, as a generation of extremely forward-thinking creatives and thinkers who are addressing these issues. But I haven't been back to Martinique for a while now, so I don't know how that manifests itself on the ground, how it would manifest itself in everyday conversations and everyday experiences. I think that it is so deeply ingrained in the Martinican psyche, and it's deeply ingrained in the psyche of people all over the Caribbean. It's this, it's so many hundreds of years of living, in a society where black skin is seen as inferior. That those internalized racisms are going to continue. And Frantz Fanon, who is the Martinican theorist, he was in the 50s somebody who really lifted the lid on.
Such a genius.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's only now that a lot of people are really celebrating Fanon, and in Martinique as well. He's been, I think, seen as a little bit too radical to be celebrated as a Martinican figurehead. But now, his legacy is being celebrated a lot more.
Yeah. Interestingly, I remember I did like a stage, like a kind of a 6 weeks waitressing job in Martinique. And there was a day when my sister and I just went into the city to get like some hair product. And it took us so long to find like black hair products in the city, the capital city of Martinique. It was really like, why is this so hard? You know what I mean? In a country that the majority actually would be using those products. Why can't we find? Why is that not like something that is really easy to find? So I thought that was really interesting, and a really interesting reflection of the country.
Yeah, I felt I was similar in Jamaica, and when I lived in Kingston for a while, people would always stop me and say, "What's going on? What's going on with your hair?" You just need to sort your hair out. Get a little relaxing there,
Do you feel like those kinds of comments made an impression of you in a negative way? Were there things that you had to unlearn in relation to that kind of language that you were experiencing? Did that condition you in any way that you or like subconsciously did that affect you?
Yeah, I think people I've always worn my hair very, natural and big. I've always had it big, and when I was a kid at school, I used to be teased a lot that my nickname was Bush Child. So people used to call me Bush Child or Stig of the Dump, and then, and that really affected me. And then in France, I remember being with girls, and they're saying, you're very pretty apart from your nose. Your nose is just too big, and say things like, your nose doesn't fit the rest of your face. So I think I grew up, absorbing a lot of that, but at the same time, there's something about my grandfather's legacy and my mum coming to the UK when she was only 20 and finding her feet as one of the few black women who worked for the BBC in the 60s. And my grandfather and my mother are very proud characters. My father is as well. And I always felt that I needed to be proud of who I was. And I think I carried over some of that power into my own sense of self. So I didn't change. I was never changed the way I looked. I didn't ever relax my hair. I didn't, I always wore it with pride. And I think that's to do with my sort of family legacy in a way, feeling like my granddad would come and through the generations and going, don't you dare be self-critical. Do you know how much I had to put up with and how much I had to...
Wow. Beautiful. Emily, what projects are you working on right now?
So the project that I'm working on now is I've done 2 books about the Caribbean trickster figures, and now my next project is looking at women, the role of women in carnival. So there's, you both know the sort of debates about the female body and whether carnival is, dressing up in beads and bikinis is for the male gaze, or is it about celebrating black bodies on the street and reclaiming space?
Oh, so excited about this.
I can't wait for this. I can't wait.
Yeah, so looking at those tensions.
I think we might even have to get you back for an episode about this, because it's something that Amma and I speak of often. Yeah. In fact, we have some other guests that we've already kind of been saying that that's an episode or a series.
Awesome. Yeah. And it would be great to have, I want to speak to you both about this, to get you on board, because it's going to be an international project with workshop in California and in Trinidad as well. So it should be really exciting.
Amazing. And where can our listeners learn more about you, Emily, apart from the show notes just down there?
Oh, yes. So if you just Google Emily Zobel Marshall, so it's Zobel, Emily Zobel Marshall, and then you can just see my various websites, like my university website, but you can also, on Academia Edu, you can see the papers that I've written. There's quite a lot of them that are there free to download. And then I have some videos on YouTube, interviews as well, if you search for my name in YouTube. So there's a bit of a digital footprint, especially in the last year or so. I feel like so many of the things we do now have this digital footprint, don't they? I miss all the events, but then it's quite good having this stuff recorded.
Yeah. So true. I used to pop into Emily's incredible lectures when I could, and I do miss that, but I really would recommend, like, if you can listen to Emily speaking, wow, or read one of her wonderful books, your mind will be blown, I promise.
It was great having you in the classroom, and when you came, because like you said I'm going to come along to one of your lectures, and I wasn't sure, if you would, and then I was just doing all my notes and everything, and then I looked at back at the class, and there you were. And then I thought, bloody hell, I better be good. I better
trying to blend in as a student. Oh, you're so good. You're so good. And on that note, Emily, might we be able to ask you to read one more poem for us?
Indeed. I'll read a poem which is dedicated to my great-grandmother, because it kind of echoes some of the themes that we've talked about today, about my grandmother's sacrifices for my grandfather, and then how they have kind of reverberated, through time to affect all of our family. So the poem is called "Don't Let the Boy Cut Cane." So it's a poem for Montine, my great-great-grandmother, who refused to let my grandfather, Joseph Zobel, cut cane. Don't let the boy cut cane. Don't let the boy cut cane. Let him stand in a white uniform, starched overnight in zinc buckets. His hands, don't let them furrow and crack like dark cane field earth, not baked by beating suns, not split by the cutlass, not burnt in the boiling house. Let his fingers be oiled and smell sweet, but not of sugar. Let them poise pen over paper, wear fine gloves in white French winters, hone red pencils, swing strong leather satchels, while I force my slow rolling hips into the fields, for the cane must be cut. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Wow, just wow.
Yeah, honestly, I feel so full up, and so I feel like I just want to hunker down and get into my books. This has been absolutely phenomenal, and actually it's really only the very tip And I feel really grateful to you for bringing your wisdom, your excellence, your magic, your hunger, your nourishment, and your honesty and love into the space today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amma and Ella. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real privilege to share this space with you. And good luck for your future recordings. This is a wonderful space that you're creating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can connect to us and our guests via the links in each episode's show notes. Before you go, we invite you to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the goodness to come. And if you enjoyed today, perhaps tell a friend to tell a friend. We are always grateful for you, our listeners, for our fabulous guests, and to everyone who has contributed to and been a part of our journey here.
Our music is by Tomo Carter. Everything else is brought to you by us, the PowerUp Power Team.
I'm Ella Mesma.
I am Amma Rouge. And we are PowerUp Podcast.